Hey everybody, this is a piece that I'm reading from libcom titled Democratic Centralism, the Workers' Opposition, Clandestine Opposition Movements, the Crisis in the Party, Kronstadt, and the End of the Revolutionary Period in Russia by a Michel Olivier. Says this is a short essay on the left opposition in the Bolshevik Party in Russia from 1919 to 1927, focusing mainly on the democratic centralists and the workers' opposition. This was originally published as the, quote, introduction to part 1 of La Gauche Bolchevique et le Pouvoir Ouvrier, 1919 to 1927, published in Paris, 2009. So let's go. Leonard Shapiro began his book, The Origin of the Communist Autocracy, with the following statement. Quote, "It is strange that the story of political opposition to Lenin has never before, so far as I'm aware, been told in detail or as a whole, ... end quote. Wikipedia says Leonard Shapiro lived from 1908 to 1983 and was a leading British scholar of the origins and development of the Soviet political system. Leonard Shapiro taught for many years at the London School of Economics, where he was professor of political science and with special reference to Russian studies. Shapiro was best known for his magisterial study of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, through his early work on the rise to power of the Bolshevik Party. The book, The Origins of the Communist Autocracy, was his most intellectually ambitious and innovative contribution to the field of Soviet studies. Because of Leonard Shapiro's prominence in the field and his insistence on viewing the USSR through a normative lens, Shapiro accumulated a share of detractors, including those who were uncomfortable with his embrace of totalitarianism as a descriptor of Soviet rule, and those who alleged that his reputed ties to British intelligence services made him little more than a political propagandist. Leonard Shapiro was of Russian Jewish background. His father, Max, was the University of Glasgow educated son of a wealthy businessman who owned a timber mill and forest outside Riga, Latvia. His mother, Leah, was a Polish rabbi's daughter. Born in Glasgow, he was taken to Russia and spent some of his childhood in Riga, his father having taken over the family timber business, and St. Petersburg, when his father took a position in railway administration. Leonard Shapiro returned to Britain with his parents in 1920 and completed his education in London at St. Paul's School. Then at University College London, Leonard Shapiro was called to the bar from Gray's Inn in 1932, returning to the law after the Second World War until 1955. Leonard Shapiro's fluency in Russian, German, French, and Italian led Leonard Shapiro to work for the BBC's monitoring service in 1940. In 1942, Leonard Shapiro joined the General Staff at the War Office, and from 1945 to 1946 served in the Intelligence Division of the German Control Command, reaching rank of Lieutenant Colonel. Leonard Shapiro's traditional liberalism alienated him from those scholars more sympathetic to the goals, if not the means, of Soviet socialism, such as E.H. Carr. A scholar with interests that ranged well beyond political history, Leonard Shapiro was the author of an authoritative biography of Ivan Turgenev, as well as the translator into English of Turgenev's novel, Spring Torrents. After Leonard Shapiro's death, some of his articles on liberalism, Marxism, and literature appeared in the volume Russian Studies. Leonard Shapiro had married firstly in 1943 Isabel de Madariaga, a historian of 18th century Russia. Following their divorce in 1976, Leonard Shapiro married Roma Thuis. Anyway, back to the text. leaving the text. Okay, never mind, not leaving the text. And Leonard Shapiro was right. Leonard Shapiro began work on this topic, but why did he end his account in 1922? In fact, Leonard Shapiro stopped when he believed that the central power was no longer threatened by the opposition movements, especially after a measure that had a greater impact than any other, the prohibition of internal factions pronounced at the 10th Congress of the Communist Party in March 1921, which took place at the same time that the Kronstadt revolt was being drowned in blood, is a kind of institutional view of history, that of those who are in power and who have successfully imposed their will on others. Furthermore, Leonard Shapiro writes in his conclusion, quote, "Many of them, bracket, the Bolshevik leaders, end bracket, were to rebel once again in 1923, when they discovered that what had really taken place was the consolidation and power of the Central Party apparatus. But it was then too late." End quote. From our point of view, history is not made only by victors. There are victories that prove to be defeats. For the workers' movement, which has only known a long series of defeats, what followed the revolution in Russia, that is the establishment of an imperialist state, which is generally considered to be a victory, is analyzed as a terrible defeat. On the other hand, the struggle of the Bolshevik left, as well as its ideas, are now revealed to be quite fruitful despite the succession of defeats of that era, the failure of the revolution in Germany and Hungary, the massacre of the workers who participated in the Kronstadt revolt, etc. This history therefore has yet to be written. Thus this gap in our knowledge is not restricted to the period when Lenin was still alive. For many of the communist protagonists of the era, the debates in the Russian Party began with the platform of the 46, quote, "Old Bolsheviks," of October 15, 1923, which was delivered to the Politburo of the political party. Wikipedia says the Declaration of 46 was a secret letter sent by a group of 46 leading Soviet communists to the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on the 15th of October 1923. The declaration followed Trotsky's letter, which was sent to the Politburo on the 8th of October and expressed similar concerns, and thus laying the foundation for the left opposition within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union later that year. The signatories had pointed to issues with the party ban and also called for a review of the factional ban introduced in the 10th Congress through a party conference. The vast majority of the signatories were executed during the Great Purge. Back to the text. In the platform of the 46, the old Bolsheviks severely criticized the party's economic policies, but directed even harsher criticism at the internal regime of the party. Quote, "The party has to a considerable degree ceased to be an independent living collective, ... A growing division between a hierarchy of secretaries, ... The functionaries of the party recruited from above, and the masses of the party who do not participate in its common life is evident." End quote. The lack of information on an international scale on the part of the members to the national communist parties is extraordinary during this era. It was not customary to debate the situation of the Russian party within the Communist International. What strange internationalists! Exclamation point. Russian affairs are the private preserve of the Russians! Exclamation point. Thus Bordiga expressed his stronger disagreement with this rule during the course of a very serious political dispute with Stalin on the 22nd of February 1926. At the 6th enlarged plenum of the Executive Committee of the Communist International. In which Bordiga argued in support of the International's right to debate Russian issues. At this meeting of the Executive Committee, Bordiga expressed his opposition to the theory of socialism in one country and subjected it to harsh criticism. As a consequence of this rule that stipulated that the Russian question was not subject to debate, it will be easily understood that the members of the International remained ignorant of the dissent within the Russian Communist Party until Trotsky inaugurated his open protest campaign. This is why even today the factions and currents within the Russian Party are still an affair that is largely reduced to the Trotskyist opposition for many researchers and historians of Russia. Trotsky himself helped to establish this interpretation by defining the platform of the 46, quote, old Bolsheviks, end quote, on October 15th as the platform of the opposition of 1923. Nothing could be more simplistic. The platform was independent of the letter that Trotsky wrote on the 8th of October 1923 to the Politburo, although a large number of Trotsky's political supporters also signed the platform. Meanwhile, most of the 46 signatories were left communist veterans of the 1919 faction, who for the most part had resumed their political struggle after December 1919 within the, quote, democratic centralist, end quote, group. That is, at least 16 of them that we know of, and quite frequently they had agitated in 1919 against the position that Trotsky advocated at that time. The text that follows is a continuation of the book published by the editors of the Smolny Collective about the left communist faction in Russia in 1918, and more particularly about the debate concerning the economic and social measures of the transition period. With this publication of the documents of the left communists of 1921 to 1929, we provide the reader with raw material about the divergences and struggles within the Russian Communist Party that has up until now been little known or totally unknown. We are aware of the fact that our work is still incomplete, and we hope that it will serve to inspire those who will improve and complete it. We sought to gather the important texts that have been published in French, most of them having appeared in diverse publications or books, and at various times, many of them in publications that were privately distributed. New section, Democratic Centralism, 1919 to 1921. There's an obvious and direct connection between the 1918 faction of left communists and the Group of Democratic Centralists, or, quote, Decists, which was formed in December 1919, both with regard to individuals as well as the ideas that these groups advocated. Footnote. The, quote, Praxis Center for Education and Research, Moscow, is currently in the process of preparing for publication a selection of documents and materials of the Democratic Centralists, Decists, which contains a total of approximately 50 documents with some 500 pages of theses, political documents, and of the, quote, Sopranovci, end quote, etc. The disagreements that had been temporarily put on hold due to the gravity of the situation during the course of the Civil War once again arose within the Civil War when the Civil War came to an end. The entire year of 1918 was characterized by seething dissent. In May-June 1918, at the first Congress of Economic Councils, Lenin had pronounced in favor of, quote, labor discipline, end quote, and, quote, one-man management, end quote, and the need to employ specialists in the enterprises. Osinski and Smirnov, supported by numerous provincial delegates, demanded a, quote, workers' management not just from above but also from below, end quote. Vladimir Smirnov lived from 1887 to 1937 and was a Russian communist revolutionary, member of the Bolshevik Party from 1907, and Soviet politician where he advocated a militant and doctrinally pure line. Vladimir Smirnov was a persistent critic of successive party leaders, including Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, for which he spent years in prison and exile before being executed. A subcommittee of the Congress approved a resolution mandating that 2/3 of the representatives who composed the administrative councils of the industrial enterprises should be elected from among the workers, which infuriated Lenin. In the plenary session, he caused the resolution to be modified so that at most 1/3 of the directive staff should be elected by the workers. This led to a split among the left communists. Radek was willing to accept, quote, one-man management, end quote, in exchange for the nationalization decrees of June 1918, which inaugurated the era of, quote, war communism, end quote, and in Radek's view consolidated the foundations of the regime. At this time, Bukharin also parted ways with the left. The group's ideas still found an echo and would re-emerge in the new group, the Democratic Centralists. Democratic Centralism was conceived by Osinsky, Sopranov, Smirnov, Masimovsky, and Kosior, etc., in response to the same concerns about the defense of workers' democracy against the regime's increasing militarization. They also continued to protest against the principle of, quote, one-man management, end quote, in industry, and to defend the collective or collegial principle as, quote, the most effective weapon against compartmentalization and the bureaucratic suffocation of the state apparatus, end quote. That quote's from Theses on the Collegial Principle and One-Man Management. While recognizing, as they already had in their journal, The Communist, published in 1918, the need to use bourgeois specialists in industry and the army, the communists put the accent above all on the need to maintain these specialists under the control of the rank and file. Quote, no one disputes the necessity of using the spetsy. The dispute is over how to use them, end quote. Sopranov, quoted by Daniels in The Conscience of the Revolution. The Democratic Centralists would also once again stress the need to instill life into the Workers' Council Soviets, as they had been proclaiming since 1918. They were alarmed by the loss of initiative on the part of the local councils and proposed reform measures whose purpose was to revitalize them as effective institutions of workers' democracy. Thus, during the course of a Communist Party Congress in December 1919 devoted to the question of the structure of the state, Sopranov's proposed resolution, which called for modifications in the composition of the Central Executive Committee in order to make it more representative, as well as reforms devoted to returning a degree of real power to the executive committees of the local Soviets, was approved despite the opposition of Vladimirsky, who was the official spokesman for the party. Michel Vladimirsky lived from 1874 to 1951. Michel Vladimirsky was a Soviet politician and Bolshevik revolutionary who was for a short period of time the chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee. Back to the text. A committee of the 7th Soviet Congress, which met immediately after the Communist Party Congress, also engaged in a prolonged debate on the respective proposals of Vladimirsky and Sopronov. The resolution that was adopted by this committee was based on Sopronov's proposed resolution and contained most of the measures he suggested. In the end, however, this resolution remained a dead letter. Timofey Sopronov lived from 1887 to 1937. Timofey, I don't know if it's phi or phi. Timofey Sopronov was a Russian revolutionary, old Bolshevik, and socialist militant who was one of the leaders of the left opposition in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Eighth Party Congress that met in March 1918 reorganized party operations, with a political bureau and a central committee, as well as with the formation of an organizational bureau, at a time when the policy of, quote, war communism, end quote, entailed the mobilization and control of the country's resources. In December 1919, Trotsky called for the militarization of labor, and it was at this time that the struggle of the democratic centralists was first launched. Wikipedia says, the notion of the labor army was introduced in Soviet Russia during the Russian Civil War in 1920. Initially, the term was applied to regiments of Red Army transferred from military activity to labor activities such as logging, coal mining, firewood, stocking, etc. In March-April 1920, the Ninth Congress of the Communist Party was particularly distinguished by the debate triggered by democratic centralism. The Democratic Centralists denounced the centralization and authoritarian methods of the Central Committee, which they defined as, quote, bureaucratic centralism, end quote, and, quote, authoritarian centralism, end quote, and which they connected with the administrative and economic management of the state. Footnote. See the resolution of the Ninth Congress in April 1920, quote, ultimately, management by a single person, even where this manager is a specialist, is an expression of the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. The Democratic Centralists also condemned the, quote, technocratic, end quote, organization of labor under the principle exclaimed by Lenin of one-man management, known as Edino Nachali. They accused Lenin of having distorted the meaning of the formula democratic centralism. By taking advantage of the situation of the Civil War and the new institutions created to deal with the Civil War in order to develop a hierarchical authoritarianism. The Ninth Congress voted against the democratic centralists in order to uphold the higher principle of unity, while also voting in favor of the creation of a control commission to guard against abuses of power and bureaucratism. In September 1920, the democratic centralists denounced the bureaucratization of the party and the increasing concentration of power in the hands of a small minority. The Congress ended up voting in favor of a manifesto that called for, quote, more general criticism of the party's institutions, central as well as local, end quote, and the rejection of, quote, repression of any kind against comrades because they have different ideas, end quote. This demonstrates that even during this period the party was still characterized by an atmosphere of lively debate, and that such criticism still had some influence in its ranks. See the resolution of the Ninth Party Congress concerning the new tasks of the construction of the party. Thus, in the years 1919 and 1920, the Democratic Centralists called for safeguards for freedom in the Communist Party. They did not want the Central Committee to lead the party, but to guide the party in accordance with the general line, without becoming entangled in details. They insisted that the, quote, rank-and-file militants, end quote, should debate questions before any important decisions are made. The minority viewpoints should be represented in electoral slates for every party election, and they should also be provided with the means to publicize their opinions. The attitude of these militants in opposition to the measures implemented by the regime during the Civil War period may be summarized by the following words of Osinski, who declared in March 1920 at the Ninth Congress of the Communist Party, quote, Comrade Lenin has revealed here today a very original understanding of democratic centralism, ... Comrade Lenin says that all democratic centralism consists of is that the Congress elects the Central Committee and the Central Committee governs, ... With such an original definition we cannot agree. We consider that democratic centralism ... consists of carrying out the directives of the Central Committee through local organizations, the autonomy of the latter, and the responsibility for individual spheres of work, end quote. That quote's from Osinski, Minority Report on Building the Economy, quoted in Robert V. Daniels' edited volume, Documentary History of Communism in Russia, From Lenin to Gorbachev. Later in the same report, Osinski said, quote, ... the basic slogan which we should proclaim at the present time is the unification of military work, military forms of organization, and methods of administration, with the creative initiative of the conscious workers. If under the banner of military work, you in fact begin to implant bureaucratism, we will disperse our own forces and fail to fulfill our tasks, end quote. The same political positions in defense of the initiative of the workers were still encountered in 1927, as we see in On the Eve of Thermidor and throughout the entire history of the left communists. Some members of the Democratic Centralists had already been involved in the, quote, military opposition, end quote, a short-lived movement that arose in March 1919. According to Wikipedia, the military opposition was a faction of the Russian Communist Party Bolsheviks which arose in 1918 to 1919, chiefly among Bolsheviks serving in the Red Army who opposed Trotsky's efforts to organize the army along conventional lines. At its high point of influence at the Eighth Party Congress, 18th 18th to the 23rd of March 1919. It was led by Ivan Smirnov and others, including Georgy Safarov, Georgy Pyatakov, Andrei Bubnov, Yemelyan Yaroslavsky, Vladimir Sorin, Philippe Goloshchiokin, Alexander Myasnikov, N.G. Tamachev, R.S. Samoilov, and S.K. Menin. Many of the military opposition were former, quote, left communists, end quote, who had opposed the signing of the Brest-Litovsk 1918 that had exited Russia from World War I. The members of the faction criticized the amount of authority enjoyed by, quote, military specialists, end quote, former Tsarist officers, and demanded that more power be given to the army's political commissars. While the earlier demands of the left for a return to a militia army with elected officers, the abolition of all ranks, and the abolition of the death penalty had largely been silenced by March 1919, resentment was expressed against Trotsky's high-handed manner. At a closed meeting, the military opposition won a vote on the matter of 37 votes to 20, although in the Congress itself, Trotsky won by a vote of 174 to 95. To placate the opposition, increased numbers of, quote, red commanders, end quote, officers of proletarian origins, began being trained at the General Staff Academy of the Red Army and other institutions. The issue flared up again at both the Ninth Party Congress in 1920 and the 10th Party Congress in 1921. There Trotsky was opposed by many, such as Clement Voroshilov, who led the movement to remove him from power following the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924. Back to the text. The necessities of the Civil War then compelled the formation of a centralized fighting force, the Red Army, composed not only of workers but also of recruits from the peasantry and other social layers. This army rapidly took on the contours of the hierarchical structure established in the rest of the state apparatus. The election of officers was soon abolished as, quote, politically unnecessary and from the technical point of view impractical, end quote. Trotsky, Work, Discipline, and Order, 1920. Bracket, the transcript of his speech delivered in Moscow on the 28th of March, 1918. American translators note, end bracket. The death penalty for refusal to engage the enemy, saluting, and special protocols for relations with officers were re-established, and these measures further reinforced hierarchical distinctions, especially on the general staff of the army, as well as in the recruitment of former officers who had served at every level in the imperial army. The main spokesman for this opposition was Vladimir Smirnov, who opposed the tendency to model the Red Army on the standards of the classical bourgeois army. He was neither against the formation of the Red Army. The journal The Communist had vigorously advocated such an army since January 1918, nor the employment of military, quote, specialists, end quote, but he was against excessive discipline and hierarchy and demanded that the general political orientation of the army should not be divorced from communist principles. The party leadership accused the members of the military opposition, in an attempt to tar them with the brush of the Brest-Litovsk debate, of wanting to dismantle the army and replace the army with a system of guerrilla detachments that was more adapted to peasant or partisan warfare. This accusation was, however, groundless. In fact, most party members did not distinguish bourgeois forms of hierarchical centralization from centralization and self-discipline originating from the base, which is the hallmark that characterizes the proletariat. The opposition of the military opposition would be rejected. New section, the workers' opposition. The workers' opposition, for the most part, had nothing to do with the orientations of the democratic centralists, even though some members of the communist left of 1918 are found among its ranks, such as Alexander Kollontai and Myasnikov. The political background of Gabriel Myasnikov and his working-class comrades is harder to characterize. Myasnikov was a member of the communist left in 1918, but Myasnikov found himself in the movement of the workers' opposition. But if Myasnikov found himself in the movement of the workers' opposition, this is because this fraction of the Communist Party was composed, for the most part, of workers, while the Democratic Centralists were largely members of the Central Committee and the leading institutions of the party. On the other hand, a certain number of other persons whose history we can trace and who later joined the workers' opposition had come from another leftist current of the Bolshevik Party. Since the period before Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917, the faction of the metal workers of Petrograd, inspired by Shliapnikov and Kollontai, advocated the idea that the workers' councils were the indispensable element for revolutionary power, and in their advocacy of this position they were opposed by the Bolshevik right wing, which, like the Mensheviks, advocated the existence of the workers' assemblies for the sole purpose of supporting and consolidating the government power of the bourgeoisie which had overthrown Tsarism. It was their insistence on this factor, however, which, thanks to the factory committees that supplied the reserves of the Red Guard under the motivation of Shliapnikov and Eremeyev, that's my best guess at pronunciation of that, Eremeev, allowed the Bolsheviks to be victorious in October. According to Wikipedia, Konstantin Eremeyev lived from 1874 to 1931. He was a Russian Bolshevik revolutionary, Soviet military leader, journalist, and newspaper editor. Back to the text. Thus it was subsequently the case that the workers' opposition represented the workers who were for the most part enrolled in the trade unions, and it always enjoyed the support of the majority in the metal workers' trade union. In March 1921, at the 10th Party Congress, a controversy came to a head within the Bolshevik Party that had been building steam since the end of the Civil War, the trade union question. On the surface, it was a debate about the role of the trade unions during the dictatorship of the proletariat, but it was in fact the expression of much more profound problems concerning the future of state power and its relations with the working class. For tactical reasons, Lenin restricted the debate to the trade union question, and the other questions were therefore swept out of sight. Briefly, there were three positions in the party on the trade union question. That of Trotsky, Bukharin, etc., in favor of the total integration of the trade unions in the, quote, workers' state, end quote, in which they would have the task of stimulating the productivity of labor. In this regard, Trotsky sought to impose a carbon copy of the program he advocated for the organization of the Red Army. That of Lenin, for whom the trade unions should always act as institutions for the defense of the class, even against the, quote, workers' state, end quote. Lenin defended the idea that the trade unions, too, suffered from, quote, bureaucratic deformations, end quote. Parenthesis, platform of the 10, and parenthesis, a position that he presented as an intermediate position. And the other position was that of the workers' opposition in favor of the management of production by the industrial trade unions, which must remain independent of the Soviet state. See all three proposals in Alexander Kollontai's The Workers' Opposition. In fact, the entire framework of this debate was totally inadequate and failed to address the real problems, the condition of the working class and its power. The workers' opposition expressed in a confused and uncertain way the antipathy of the proletariat towards the bureaucratic and military methods that were increasingly becoming the main characteristics of the regime. The working class wanted to change these things now that the rigors of the Civil War were a thing of the past. The leaders of the workers' opposition came, for the most part, from the trade union apparatus and appear to have enjoyed a great deal of support among the working class in the southeast of European Russia and in Moscow, especially among the metal workers. Shlyapnikov and Medvedev two of the group's leaders were both metal workers. This is in reference to Sergei Medvedev. Yeah. Two of the group's leaders were both metal workers. So too was Alexander Kollontai, the most famous member of the group who drafted their programmatic text, Platform on the Trade Union Question, presented by the group at the 10th Party Congress. Quote, the 10th Congress of the party lasted from March 8th to the 16th of 1921. Quote, the workers' opposition was born from the most profound depths of the industrial proletariat of Soviet Russia and has derived its force not only from the shocking living and working conditions of 7 million industrial proletarians, but also from the multiple deviations, reversals, and contradictions of our government policies, and even from clear deviations from the distinct class-based and consistent line of the communist program, end quote. Kollontai, the workers' opposition. Kollontai proceeded to highlight the shocking economic conditions that the new Soviet power had to confront after the Civil War. Kollontai also called attention to the expansion of the bureaucratic layer whose origins were situated outside of the working class, among the intellectuals, the peasantry, the remnants of the former bourgeoisie, etc. This layer was becoming increasingly dominant in the Soviet apparatus and in the party itself. It encouraged the advancement of social climbers and careerists who had nothing but contempt for the interests of the proletariat. For the members of the workers' opposition, as the left communists before them had explained, the Soviet state itself was not a pure proletarian state, but a heterogeneous institution that was obliged to maintain an equilibrium between the different classes and layers of society. The workers' opposition insisted on the fact that the best way to ensure that the revolution should continue to be faithful to its original goals was not to confide its management to non-proletarian technocrats and to socially ambiguous state institutions, but rather to rely upon the independent activity and creative power of the working class masses themselves, end quote. Quote, this truth, which is clear and simple for any worker, has been overlooked by the highest echelons of our party. Communism cannot be decreed. Communism cannot be decreed. It must be created by the indignation of living men, sometimes at the cost of mistakes, but by the creative impulse of the working class itself. End quote. Kollontai, the workers' opposition. The workers' opposition had important limitations, as it conceived the dictatorship of the proletariat as the dictatorship of the party. As was the case with many left communists, this view led its members to engage in occasional demonstrations of loyalty to the party, this time during the course of the 10th Party Congress. When the Kronstadt revolt broke out, the leaders of the workers' opposition would prove their loyalty to the party by volunteering for the front. Footnote, Myasnikov was the only one to oppose the assault on Kronstadt. None of the other left fractions in Russia understood the importance of the Kronstadt uprising as the last great struggle of the workers for the re-establishment of the power of the councils. At the conclusion of the Congress, the workers' opposition was nonetheless condemned as a, quote, anarchist petty bourgeois deviation, a, quote, anarchist petty bourgeois deviation, end quote, and a, quote, objectively counter-revolutionary element, end quote. The prohibition of, quote, factions, end quote, at the 10th Party Congress delivered a fatal blow to the workers' opposition, but it was also a fatal blow to the party itself, even though the measure was supposed to be implemented as an exceptional case to deal with an exceptional situation. Footnote, Radek declared, quote, in voting for this resolution, I feel that it can well be turned against us, and nevertheless I support it, ... Let the Central Committee in a moment of danger take the severest measures against the best party comrades if it finds this necessary, ... Let the Central Committee even be mistaken. That is less dangerous than the wavering which is now observable, end quote. Quoted by Shapiro. In 1921, another reason for the weakness of the criticism, end footnote. In 1921, another reason for the weakness of the criticisms directed by the workers' opposition at the regime was its almost total lack of any international perspectives. Democratic centralists had more global and internationalist orientations, which is why this current was capable of surviving and even giving birth to another movement, as we shall see. One moment. New section. Clandestine opposition movements. The workers' opposition, however, did not disappear at the 10th Party Congress. In February 1922, the workers' opposition's members attended the 4th Congress of the Communist International. See letter of the 22 members of the opposition to the delegates at the Congress of the Communist International. Later, at the 11th Party Congress, Shlepnikov and Medvedev once again issued an appeal to the members of the party. Shlepnikov and Medvedev attacked the party's policies, especially its proposal to exclude them because they had not desisted from their political activities despite the condemnation of factions. They were not excluded, however, although 2 other members of the opposition were. Mitin for being a, quote, malevolent disorganizer, end quote, and Kuznetsov, a, quote, as, quote, foreign to the proletariat, end quote. And Kuznetsov. Yeah, I can't find anything on Kuznetsov. Yeah, only thing that's coming up when I type in that is like generals from later on. Anyway. It seems that some members of the workers' opposition were still active in 1924, as one may read in the letter from Medvedev published by the Bulletin Communiste in 1927. In 1924, the workers' opposition distributed a critique of the party's actions to foreign comrades. The document is interesting because it refutes everything that is generally taken for granted concerning the workers' opposition, that is, that it had rapidly disappeared after 1922. Having been decimated, however, the opposition was soon taken from the left by clandestine groups within the party such as Workers' Truth and the Workers' Group. During this period, Workers' Truth expressed its hostility towards the workers' opposition, which it considered to be a, quote, objectively reactionary group, end quote, whose members were nothing but, quote, wolves in sheep's clothing, end quote. The workers' group, composed of those who supported the positions of Myasnikov, who was their most well-known representative, would have a future and would be the most fruitful opposition movement within the framework of the dictatorship. New section: The crisis in the party, Kronstadt, and the end of the revolutionary period in Russia. ... The regime's contradictions, held in check by the Civil War, rose to the surface in 1921. The peasant revolts, which began in September 1920, spread and gained in intensity. In February 1921, the Cheka counted no fewer than 118 uprisings, the most violent of which erupted in the province of Tambov. According to Wikipedia, the Tambov Rebellion, which I don't know much about, honestly, of 1920 to 1922 is one of the largest and best organized peasant rebellions challenging the Bolshevik government during the Russian Civil War. The uprising took place in the territories of modern Tambov Oblast and part of the Voronezh Oblast, less than 500 kilometers, 300 miles southeast of Moscow. In Soviet historiography, the rebellion was referred to as the Antonov's Mutiny, so named after Alexander Antonov, a former official of the Socialist Revolutionary Party who opposed the government of the Bolsheviks. The Tambov uprising began in August 1920 with resistance to the forced confiscation of grain and developed into a guerrilla war against the Red Army Cheka units and the Soviet Russian authorities. The bulk of the peasant army was destroyed by large Red Army reinforcements using chemical weapons in the summer of 1921. Smaller groups continued resistance until the following year. It is estimated that around 100,000 people were arrested and about 15,000 killed during the suppression of the uprising. The movement was later portrayed by the Soviets as anarchical banditry, similar to other left-wing anti-Bolshevik movements that opposed them during this period. Back to the text. These revolts sometimes mobilized as many as 50,000 rebels at a time. In the cities, the situation was no better. In 1920, industrial production fell to approximately one-fifth of its level in 1913. The cities continued to experience problems with the supply of food and fuel. The precariousness of their living conditions led numerous inhabitants of the cities to return to the countryside. The population of Petrograd fell from 2 million in 1917 to 750,000 in 1920. That's insane. Didn't realize it was like that intense. The number of industrial workers fell by 50%. The number of industrial workers fell by 50%. It was in this context that the Kronstadt revolt erupted. It was a shocking ordeal for the revolution and for the workers' movement. Many Bolsheviks were haunted by this event for a long time. As Bukharin told delegates at the Third Congress of the Communist International in 1921, quote, "Who says that the Kronstadt rising was white? No. For the sake of the idea, for the sake of our task, we were forced to suppress the revolt of our erring brothers. We cannot look upon the Kronstadt sailors as our enemies. We love them as our true brothers, our flesh and blood, ... end quote. The 10th Party Congress unfolded in this kind of environment and revealed a divided party in the grips of a serious crisis. Lenin stated on the occasion that this debate that there were no fewer than 8 platforms, which were finally reduced to 3 before the opening of the Congress. But this extreme discord did lead Lenin to write an article, The Crisis in the Party. This crisis could no longer be eliminated despite the bureaucratic measures prohibiting factions, as we saw above, Nothing could resolve this political problem, especially not administrative measures. The sickness whose profound causes Lenin attempted to diagnose would prove to be a general crisis of the regime, which entailed a crisis within the party and the relations between the party, the state, and the masses. The fact that the crisis should be manifested in the trade union problem is no accident. It constitutes the core of these relations and the contradictions of power for the working class. Lenin came closest to the heart of the matter when he said, quote, "The real divergence, is not where Comrade Trotsky perceives it, but in the way to win the masses over, to deal with them and to organize the connection," end quote. After the 10th Congress and its administrative measures, the crisis of the party would become permanent. It was in this very context that the, quote, platform of the 46, end quote, old Bolsheviks unexpectedly appeared. The crisis had entered a new stage because it was at this time that the leadership clique broke apart, signaling the beginning of Stalin's seizure of power. At first, the left communist current cooperated with Trotsky's opposition before the left communists evolved in their own direction and became more radical. The democratic centralists participated in the unified opposition. Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, etc., formed in the spring of 1926. Very soon, however, attempts to engage in discussion within the party proved to be futile, and the former democratic centralists perceived this failure to be a confirmation of what was then beginning to dawn upon them. The Bolshevik Party had become the party of the bureaucracy, and they had to make a commitment to form an independent organization. This is why they broke with the unified opposition under the quote, after the quote, declaration of peace, end quote, signed by 6 members of the Central Committee on the 16th of October 1926. The signers were Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Sokolnikov, Pyatakov, and Evdokimov. They perceived this declaration as the capitulation of the united opposition. In 1926, the Group of 15 was formed by former democratic centralists. The Group of the 15. In 1926, the Group of the 15 was formed by democratic centralists. This is what Myasnikov has to say about this group. Quote, Comrade Sopronov, bracket, a former democratic centralist, end bracket, reappeared once again in 1926-27 with the platform of democratic centralism. It is a totally new platform of a group that is consequently totally new without any other connection with the past of, quote, democratic centralism, end quote, than the fact that its spokesman is Sopronov, end quote. As Myasnikov believed, and Myasnikov continues, quote, the Group of the 15 is named for the fact that the platform was signed by 15 comrades. In its main points, in its evaluation of the nature of the state of the USSR, in its ideas concerning the state of the workers, the program of the 15 is very close to the ideology of the workers' group, end quote. The two groups would move closer together politically during this period. In August 1928, the Moscow Congress of the Workers' Group, it was announced that the, quote, Workers' Group had voted to approve the text of an appeal to the Group of the 15 and the remnants of the workers' opposition, re-inviting them to unite on the basis of a common program, on the basis of the November Revolution, bracket, the October Revolution according to our calendar, end bracket, end quote. Myasnikov went on to say in the same article in L'Ouvrier Communiste, quote, at the same time meeting a resolution was proposed to create statutes for the communist worker parties of the USSR because it was only read in the attendees without having been subjected to serious debate. It was only read to the attendees without having been subjected to serious debate. The proposal was not considered to be an official declaration of the Council, but merely the view of one member of the Central Bureau. In its appeal, the workers' group mentioned this proposal as a matter for debate so that the basis upon which the groups in question would have to unite to form the Russian Communist Worker Party should be definitely adopted. For this purpose, the resolution to constitute the Central Bureau of the Workers' Group as the central organizational bureau for the Communist Worker Parties of the USSR has been adopted. All the members of the Group of 15 were, during that period, scattered in exile. That is why we were unable to organize a plenary meeting. But one member of the Group of 15 did attend the meeting with the right to vote. End quote. Final section. In prisons and concentration camps, 1933 to 1937, Seliger depicts how the group that was thus formed, essentially on a new basis, on that of the Manifesto of the 15, or that of On the Eve of Thermidor, was constantly winning over the militants of the, quote, irreconcilable, end quote, Bolshevik Leninist wing, and finally became the majority opposition group in the Vorkuta prison. It was the orientation within the working class of the workers' group, which was by far the most resolute politically, that it allowed it to rally other elements around it. Quote, the Myasnikov group, the Decists, a few former Trotskyists, altogether some 20 to 25 prisoners, 20 to 25 prisoners, formed a quote federation of left-wing communists, end quote, end quote. The end. Thank you so much for listening. I want to look up something real quick. Vorkutlag. The Vorkuta corrective labor camp, commonly known as Vorkutlag, was a major Gulag labor camp in the Soviet Union located in Vorkuta, Komi-Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. It was in operation from 1932 until 1962. Vorkutlag was one of the largest camps in the Gulag system. Vorkutlag housed 73,000 prisoners at its peak in 1951, containing Soviet and foreign prisoners, including prisoners of war, dissidents, political prisoners, quote, enemies of the state, end quote, and common criminals who were used as forced labor in the exploitation of coal mines, coal mining works, and forestry. The camp was administered by the Joint State Political Directorate. From 1932 to 1934, the NKVD from 1934 to 1946, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Soviet Union, from 1946 until Vorkutlag's closure in 1962. The Vorkuta Gulag was the site of the Vorkuta Uprising in July 1953. Thank you so much for listening. Is there anything else that's juicy on here? Thank you so much for listening.